Welcome to this week's online study of the Gospel passage for October 19th. We're still getting started with this project, so I'll mention again how important it is for me to hear from you, your comments and critiques, suggestions on how to make this a meaningful and useful study. Please be frank. I can take it. I'm not willing to concede after this being just the fourth video that I've perfected this particular method. And before we turn to the text for this week, I've got another conversation question for you. I'm going to show you a series of pictures, pairs of people that I would be shocked to learn are working together. And after you see the several pairs I've presented, I'll have you pause the video to consider the conversation question that will follow. Now that you've had a chance to talk about some of your own strange bedfellows, we'll turn to the text for the 19th of October. It's a passage that is so famous that the familiar part may have obscured some other of the interesting details in it. Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere, and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then Jesus said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. Okay, that's our passage for this week. If you'd like to read it in a different translation, I'll stop talking, you hit pause, and we'll get back together in just a bit. One more time out if you want it. Hit pause again if you need a little time to reflect on what you've just heard, or to write down some notes or some questions. I'll be back in a moment. After 3 weeks of attacks on them by Jesus, by means of the 3 different parables that he told against them, the religious leaders of his day have decided to fight back. The Pharisees are instigators of this attempt to, quote, entrap him in what he said. And right away, their desperation is clearly apparent. If you understand what strange bedfellows the Pharisees and the Herodians make. In the most general terms, the Herodians were the no-nonsense politicians of the day. In short, they would use whatever means necessary to keep their patron, King Herod, in power. And if he was in power, they would benefit from that. Opposite them were the Pharisees. They were religious leaders as opposed to the Herodians, who you might call political leaders. And their motivations were sound. They get a lot of bad press in the New Testament, but their motivations were sound. In so many words, they would say, you want to know why our nation's been overrun again and again and again and again by foreign armies and occupations? It's because we have failed to keep God's covenant. And one of our chief errors was thinking that there are political solutions to our religious or spiritual problems. Their legalistic mindset has caused them to misunderstand God's program in many ways, and they opposed Jesus because they were so certain of their own understanding of God and of the Scriptures. But that these two parties, really almost diametrically opposed to each other, are now united in their opposition to Jesus is a huge sign of how desperate they all are to rid themselves of this nuisance named Jesus. Moving on to their question, I imagine that no matter what language this passage is translated into, their words have to sound smarmy and creepy. I tried not to overdo it when I was reading the text in the video, but let me tell you, it was hard not to. So when they ask, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not, they're hoping to spring a damned if you do, damned if you don't trap on him like he sprung on them a few weeks ago. If he says pay your taxes, they'll badmouth him to the rest of his own people who hate paying taxes to the Romans almost more than anything else. But if he says don't pay your taxes, they'll rat him out to the Romans as preaching sedition and treason. But Jesus sees through the insincerity of their introduction and the trap of their question and asks for a coin. The denarius was a coin that was what a laborer would be paid for one day's work. So it was really something of value. If in California today you worked 8 hours at California's minimum wage of $9 an hour, a denarius, a day's wage, would be $72, before taxes, of course. And that's not an insignificant amount of money. So when Jesus looks at this denarius, he asks, whose head is this and whose title? In the original Greek, the word translated head is actually icon. In English, the word has a variety of uses. The small picture on a computer screen that represents a program or a function, a person who is very successful and admired, a widely known symbol, or an image that you will frequently find in Orthodox Christian churches. With those uses of icon in mind, I've got another conversation question for you. Thinking of the variety of icons in our society, talk about one that when you see it gives you a positive feeling or makes a positive impression. In the ancient world, money belonged to the one whose picture appeared on it. So in this case, if Caesar's picture is on the money, it belongs to Caesar, and that happens to be the literal word behind the word emperor in our translation. If Caesar's picture is on it, then it belongs to him, so give it to him, says Jesus. But Jesus doesn't end his answer to their question there. I'm pretty sure he's hoping the religious leaders that he's doing battle with know their Bible pretty well, and they must. Because way back in the first chapter of the Bible, we're told that when God created humankind, we were made in God's image. And guess what? In the original Greek, that word image is icon. Same word. So you are wearing God's picture on you. And if Caesar's image is on the coin and it belongs to Caesar, what do you think it means if God's picture is on you? You belong to God. I think Jesus' enemies knew where his answer was leading. And it says they were amazed. I think Jesus' enemies knew where his answer was leading them. It says they were amazed. I don't think they told Jesus this. We are made in the image of God, totally. There's not a part of you, a part of your life, part of my life, that really just belongs to me. It all belongs to God. So everything I think, do, and say might be considered an offering. Everything? Those ancient coins with Caesar's face on them were surely covered with some dirt and grime when archaeologists first discovered them. Those scientists carefully removed the mud so the original could be clearly seen. We bear the image of God, but has that image become hard to see? In a moment, I'll have you stop or pause the video to consider ways to prepare for worship. But before I do, I want to say a word about baptism fonts. Years ago, many, if not most, baptism fonts, at least in Lutheran churches, were located up in the front, probably off to the side of the altar. Many times they were covered, and most often they were dry until a baptism was scheduled. In more recent years, more and more Lutheran churches, and others as well, have been recovering what Martin Luther has been telling us about baptism for almost 500 years, that it is a daily dying and rising with Christ, a daily washing away of the mud in our lives, you might say. So little by little, churches have been moving their fonts from up there in the chancel closer to where the people enter the sanctuary, to be reminded that it is by baptism into Christ's death and resurrection that we become part of the church. And that we leave it open and full of water allows people to stop by, dip their fingers in the water, maybe retrace the sign of the cross on themselves as a way of being reminded of what Jesus did for them, for me, for you, in our baptism. In his dying and rising, we have died and rise. In a moment, I'll ask you to pause the video one last time to consider a worship preparation question. Once again, this is one that you may want to consider just for yourself, but if you're with someone you trust, you might be able to talk together about this question. What are the ways or the places there might be some mud obscuring the image of God in your life? What is getting in the way of letting the light of Christ shine through you? And when you walk past the font next time you're in church, what might you ask God to forgive and wash away? Thanks, y'all, for joining in this week's study. And I say y'all because I'm assuming that on the other side of the screen there's at least two of you taking part in what we're doing here together. I'll close this week's study with a little video with music attached. Let's call it a video meditation on baptism. So relax and enjoy it, and I'll see you next time.